So I suggested Sanders would win big in Washington, and he did. I refrained from making any suggestions about Alaska, and I suggested that Clinton should be favored in Hawaii based on the results in the other Pacific Island primaries. So my Hawaii argument was based on the idea that Hawaii would vote similarly to other Pacific Island states, but it was never presented with much confidence. There wasn't any polling done, and the demographic modeling is anti-scientific and should be rejected. I always said that this idea was preliminary and subject to modification by incoming data. All anybody could have given you was an inference, that is a guess. One could have argued that Sanders should have won because it was a caucus, but Hawaii had a secret ballot, so that logic of peer pressure is kind of funny. Nor is Hawaii a white state, so all of the modeling and everything, like it didn't. There wasn't another state with a population like Hawaii's. So even if you suggested that the best that any of the demographic modeling could have done would have been like a rather clearly fallacious type of thinking, right? So I made a guess, but it turned out not to be right. And actually, I think the better analysis is likely to invert my argument. I had essentially suggested that Clinton should be favored because of greater name recognition in what is really a distant colony. And that was the pattern in the other Pacific Island states. I guess it was Northern Marianas, and there was another Pacific Island region that Clinton had won as well. And if you look at the results, the way that Clinton had won it was in such a way as to indicate that Sanders was not really well known, right? So she'd win like 58 to 23 or something, right? Indicating that there was like a large amount of the population that voted for somebody else, or maybe it was like a write-in local candidate or whatever. It didn't seem as though Sanders was getting any kind of media out there at all, sort of thing, right? In the absence of any polling, it seemed, somewhat reasonable to suggest that it should be roughly the same kind of pattern, right? But what I'm suggesting, when you look at it, it was probably the other way around. What was probably true in the end was that the name recognition worked against her, which was to say it was probably less about a vote for Sanders and more about a vote against Clinton. It doesn't look like turnout was low, and if you look at the numbers, they added up to 100, right? So it kind of adds up to that sort of result. But for substantive policy, if there was an actual policy issue, how about the Asia pivot? Maybe concerned about Clinton starting a war in the Pacific. There's no polling, so all I can do is make stuff up. So what I'm suggesting, like I say, I initially suggested that what was probably going to be true was that nobody knew who Sanders was in Hawaii, so Clinton would win because of that. I've never heard Sanders talk at all about Hawaii. I doubt there was really any media directed. I know that one of the was it Tulsi Gabbard, but I mean, how big of an effect would that really have? So that was my argument, right? But what I'm suggesting is, okay, maybe it was the other way around. Maybe Clinton's policies are so unpopular that there was kind of an anybody but Clinton mindset that sunk in. Because, I mean, the reality is that Hawaii is right in the middle of harm's way in the case of a Pacific war. Clinton has been very aggressive about a containment policy regarding China. She won't call it a containment policy, but I mean, it's just more Orwellian language coming out of it. It's quite obviously a containment policy. The Chinese know it's a containment policy. Every analyst who's using their brain knows it's a containment policy. And in fact, the State Department knows that it's a containment policy. This idea of pretending that it's anything but a containment policy is just nonsense. And it's nonsense on the level of nonsense. Everybody knows it's nonsense. There's no use in pretending otherwise, right? So Clinton was very involved with this whole Asia pivot. And if I lived in Hawaii, I would be concerned about that. Okay, because it does look like Clinton wants to start a war in in Hawaii, right? Or sorry, not in Hawaii, but like in the Pacific region. And I mean, I would want to vote against that. And if you look at what um, Tulsi Gabbard was actually saying, and you read between the lines a little, that's kind of, it sounds like that's what she was really saying too. Okay, so that's, initially I was thinking, okay, nobody knows who Bernie Sanders is. Clinton will win on name recognition. Maybe it was the other way around. It was everybody knows who Clinton is, and nobody wanted her to be president, so her opponent won by default. That's what I'm thinking. But I mean, I'm inferring things. There was no data to begin with. There's no data now. I mean, well, I should be careful here. I remember when I was in school, one of my professors made a point to remind us that we were not mathematicians yet. And the truth is, I have not worked a day as a mathematician. So, but I did go to school for a very long time, long enough that in terms of bulk courses completed, I wouldn't be talking about a master's degree, but a PhD. So I studied a lot of math for a really long time, and so I lost my train of thought there. What I meant to say was that I was going to say I'm a mathematician, but then I stopped and I said, well, maybe I should become a little bit more careful about what I call myself here. The point was that I'm not a clairvoyant. I'm reading numbers. And if I don't have numbers, then there's not a lot that I can do, right? I can take a guess, but I reject the kind of predictive modeling that you see people do. I think it's anti-scientific. There's other ways to go about it. Even if I didn't, that would have been useless anyways, because it's a state that's unlike any other state. There is no other state like Hawaii. The closest to a state like Hawaii would have been the Pacific Island states or primaries that I was trying to draw information from. And if you were going to model it and were going to do predictive modeling, you would have wanted to base it on that information, not information in Alabama. But that said, there wouldn't have been enough information to build in a useful model anyways. So we really had nothing to go on with Hawaii. I do think that the approach I took was superior, but in the end it didn't work out. Okay. Either way, that buffers the loss in Arizona a little. I had suggested he'll probably, well, I had really refrained from making a prediction in Hawaii or Alaska. I just pointed out, wait a second here. The data that we have for the lower 48 is likely not applicable to Hawaii or Alaska, so let's be careful about drawing conclusions. Let's assume that they split. He did better than a split, so that helped them up. He came out of that a little bit better than he could have, and that helped buffer the loss in Arizona a little. Even still, he lost in Arizona by a lot more than even the worst estimates would have suggested, I think. I think that I was expecting a worst case scenario would be Clinton around 55. So he's about 25 delegates behind where I said he should be. I also suggested that he only really needs to split Wisconsin, so that's the next state up. He's about 25 behind where I said he should be. I said he needed to split Wisconsin, so now he needs to do better in Wisconsin. My logic or my argument was, you look at Wisconsin, it's kind of halfway between Minnesota and Illinois. Is it going to be more like Minnesota, or is it going to be more like Illinois? He did quite well in Minnesota, not as well in Illinois. I said, let's split the difference. Now Wisconsin needs to behave more like Minnesota than Illinois in order to make up the difference. And he does still need to be aiming for around 200 going into New York. If he does really well in Wisconsin, and I mean everybody expects him to win in Wyoming, whatever that means, the 12 delegates or whatever it is. But hey, that's if he can make up 10 delegates there, it's better than a poke in the eye, right? So that helps too. But he's got to make up more in Wisconsin than I initially suggested, and he still needs to be aiming for around 200 as a difference going into New York. And he absolutely must win New York. Okay? There's no question he's got to win New York. Now, I would not advise taking early polls seriously, but it is a closed primary. That's bad. And the results in Massachusetts and Illinois, which were not closed primaries, but are going to be roughly similar to New York in most ideological measurements, that would suggest a split is more likely than a win. So that's what you have to keep in mind going into New York, is that, again, nothing's changed. He still has to win New York, there's no question. But judging on what we've seen up to this point, I would temper your enthusiasm. Don't give up. Keep trucking there, but because I'm a person of numbers, I need to be realistic. It's not the numbers don't look good for Bernie in New York at this point, but we'll see how things turn out.